And let me throw this by. This is my thoughts right now. This is what I think. I think there was probably some sort of Q document floating around. Then I think Mark is the first gospel. Then I think Mark and Q are now floating around together in different circles.
Yeah.
Marcion has both. Marcion constructs a gospel using both Q and Mark, and this is how you get what we call Luke. But it's Marcion first.
That's pretty close to the hypothesis that I've been arguing now for about 3 years in an open science book. The first hypothesis is that Marcion's gospel is a two-source gospel. Now, whether or not he's the author or editor of the gospel, to me, it's kind of moot. We can get into specifics on that, but to me, I see a very clear two-source program where the Q stuff, all the sayings of Jesus, they're very densely present in Marcion's gospel, but it also has significant sequential overlaps with Mark in two places. But I would say it's not the Mark as we know it. It's an early version of Mark. Like Mark gets much later expanded.
Sure.
It almost like tripled in size, likely in the mid-2nd century. So we shouldn't assume.
Yeah. I'm not surprised.
Mark and priority is actually a deeply problematic view, because it looks at this text as a a one-off production, when actually if you compare it like word for word or verse by verse, you'll see Mark is often significantly expanding these traditions. But not only that, it's actually synthesizing.
Yeah, and
Luke and Matthew, right? You can find a Lucan tradition, a Matthean tradition, and it gets smushed together.
Looking at Matthew makes you realize that there had to be some sort of form before Mark, because Mark, it's not like Matthew's copying Luke. Matthew's still looking at Mark, but it also has the stuff that shares with Luke. So it makes you wonder, there's got to be some other source there that they're all sort of getting from, which would be Q. That makes sense. I think I said it right.
And a lot of people throw out Occam's razor as if that is, we shouldn't, hypothesize sources, or we shouldn't hypothesize multiple versions. But to me, that's lazy academics, because the trajectory or the tendency in all these documents is that they're constantly being rewritten.
Right. And
that's what we see in texts across the board. If a text stays popular, if it catches on, it's always getting rewritten. That's the norm.
Occam's razor doesn't work for this, because you have to explain why is that Luke and Matthew have this source material in common that Mark doesn't have.
Yeah.
And so it's possible that there's, I guess anything's possible is what I'm saying. Anything's possible, but the likelihood is that they're probably, the way that we know how texts are copied, people don't just add their own stories to the thing. They're copying something.
Right.
That's how it usually is. It's not like Matthew came along and says, I'm going to add my favorite little story to this.
Yeah.
No, he had it. He was a copyist.
Right.
And
we can look at common trends in document production in antiquity. That's helpful, how things are constantly being rewritten. We can look at pseudonymous, like Bart Ehrman's work. He frequently looks at how people are impersonating other authors or writing works in the names of other authors. That's common, or expanding on things. But we can also just look at linguistic data patterns. So that's really what I'm trying to do for the first time with the Evangelion. Marcus Vincent's working in a very similar direction, but focus on Marcion's Apostolos, his collection of Paul's letters. But what I think I've shown is that there are statistically significant, like non-random variations between the Q sections in Marcion's gospel and then the Mark sections. So it kind of gets granular here, but for instance, if you just take the two Greek letters en, right, epsilon nu, it shows up, and you take Badoon's version as a sample in the Q sections of Marcion's gospel. That little two-letter combination, which is often a prefix, it's like the in as a prefix to a Greek word. It shows up more than 100 times in the Q section, but it shows up less than 10 times in the Mark sections. So there's a very different vocabulary going on. But then you can also look stylistically, right? There's like, you get constant, the Beatitudes, the woes, the give up your possessions, right? Like a lot of what in Jewish tradition would be called halakha, right? You have the ethical teachings that are distilled in a succession of sayings, but also fables. But then if you look in the sections that overlap with Mark, they're all controversy, or like most of them are controversy stories. Jesus does something to tick off the authorities, and it turns into an argument. Jesus heals on the Sabbath, and it turns into an argument. So the Markan overlaps are filled with controversies over miracles and ritual piety,
Yeah.
but the Q sections are full of teaching after teaching after teaching. And then the themes are different too. Like in the Q sections, there are women characters all over the place, women patrons of Jesus, women anointing Jesus. None of that in the Markan sections.
Right.
Right. All male characters in the Markan sections. Right.
Wow.
The Q sections are all about poor people, like give to the poor, blessed are the poor, give up your possessions and give to the poor. Dives and Lazarus, even, right, of stories about the poor, the rich fool, all the teachings about wealth and poverty, pretty much all of them, that they're all in Marcion's gospel, but they're all in those Q sections. The Markan passages don't give a care about the poor.
Wow.
There's nothing at all about the poor in those sections that overlap with the Markan tradition. So to me, it's super clear that Marcion's gospel is a two-source gospel, but again, like it's only about a third of the size of canonical Luke. So if it's
Wow.
really earlier than Luke, this is how we get back to Q. Right, Marcion's gospel is the direct path back to Q, and then establishing what
Wow.
its two sources are. But what I've shown is that Q, we tend to think Q is just a bunch of sayings, but if you look at Marcion's gospel, this continuity from beginning to end, like references to Aesop or concern with the poor or whatever, or female patrons, that's beginning to end. So what I would say is Q is not just a sayings gospel; it's a full passion and resurrection gospel.
Sure. I believe
Yeah.
that too.
So and that's why Mark didn't, early Mark is not inventing the gospel genre with a
Yeah.
passion and resurrection account. The early Mark is expanding it a little bit with some more references to Hebrew prophets and so on, with the suffering servant of Isaiah,
It
and
makes
that
sense.
sort of thing.
It makes sense
But
because Mark is very
it,
advanced. Mark
yeah,
it didn't just come out of a black hole like that.
right.
It looks like it's revised in some ways.
Right. Yeah. We tend to think the empty tomb is such a simplistic tradition that must have been the earliest form. And in Marcion's gospel, it has a similarly early form. There is an encounter on the road, but there are women patrons, right? No, reference to the women are there in Mark's gospel, but they just run off and are scared. And we think, oh, that's the earliest one. What I'd say is that's actually a sort of an anti-woman, version that's responding to women being the first resurrection heralds,
That's
which is what
interesting
you
'cause
get later in John.
That's one of Kelsis's things that he points out. He says, "A woman point? You want me to believe a woman? What?"
Right. Exactly. Right. What makes
So
more sense, that
that's
women
mid
were
second
the
century.
originally, yeah, and then it was later, masculinized to add credibility, or
Mm,
that they later added in women, right? So this, Mary is getting marginalized when you look at these texts.
yeah,
Like to me, there's a straight line from the women resurrection witnesses in Marcion's gospel to like the gospel of Mary and the gospel of Philip, where
yeah. Good
Mary
point.
is being sidelined in favor of Peter
Yeah.
as like the dominant male, witness of the resurrection. So yeah, there's a lot there, and I would just encourage people to go to. I have an open science book called The Gospel of the Poor, and it's got like 13,000 views so far. I've been writing it for the last three plus, almost 3 years now,
Wow.
and it details these hypotheses meticulously and does statistics and Greek reconstructions and a full like synoptic parallel chart. So, if I'm right, like it sounds hubris, I know, but I think I've basically got the synoptic problem. Like I'm on the right track in terms of
Yeah.
coming up with a scientific solution to it. That's not just conjecture or idiosyncrasy. Like I think the data just quantitatively actually backs up what I'm saying. And I think I've shown that for the first time. So this is where I want like hardcore scientists to actually like scrutinize my work and tell,
Yeah.
if I'm full
Bring
of
it.
crap, tell me I'm full of crap.
Right.
But, I think statistically, I'm sure, and this is, I think, the weakness in a lot of other potential, proposed solutions. A synoptic problem is they have no statistical data to back it up, or what statistical data they do publish, when they do, it's murky at best. It doesn't clarify the picture. It just muddles the picture, right? So they're not able to show statistically significant findings. I think what I'm beginning to show, even though I'm not a professional statistician, is that these are statistically significant variations, and these are patterns that can be validated statistically.